Welcome to Tasmania in southeastern Australia. Most areas here are inaccessible forests. Most regions are covered by clouds all year round. Some areas have primitive rivers and damp, cool canyons. Snakes, rats, insects, and ants are common. The annual rainfall of 2,400 millimeters is daunting, not to mention the occasional tropical cyclones that can blow everything away. 10 survival experts have been dropped here. The last one standing will be the champion of this season. Due to limited funding from the production team, the prize is only $250,000. However, this does not dampen the contestants' spirits. Chris, 39, makes his first appearance. He is excited at first, but reality quickly hits hard. Frankly, the starting location is not ideal. Setting up a tent alone is problematic. In Tasmania, it rains 250 days a year. Chris doesn't want to get soaked. He needs to quickly find a place to set up a temporary camp. The rainforest terrain differs from other places. The location must be flat and open. Otherwise, falling rotten wood from trees could be lethal. After searching, Chris finally finds a suitable spot. He hums a tune and clears the area. Then, he uses ropes to secure the tent corners. Before he finishes, Chris looks up and freezes. There's a huge wasp nest. Following the first come, first served rule, Chris should move immediately. But with time running out, he has to make do for one night and plan further. Rob, 41, is the second to appear. His luck is better than Chris's. Upon landing, he receives a warm welcome from the island's animals. Hearing roars close by, Rob hopes they are kangaroos or badgers, not grizzly bears. After a while, it quiets down. Rob then finds a place to rest. Gina, 52, is the third contestant. She is thrilled upon arrival. The environment is just like her hometown. She could stay here 3 months with no problem. The trees, the wind, the moss, everything feels familiar. Gina says surviving in the wild is not about defeating nature. If you think that way, nature will punish you severely. The only way to settle in the wild is to remain humble and open your heart to nature. Her understanding alone marks her as a true expert. Beck, 42, is the fourth contestant. Unlike others, Beck is just an ordinary person. She joined the show to challenge herself. She believes her resilience could win her the $250,000. After setting up her filming equipment, Beck starts building her camp. But first, she makes a digging stick. After all, to do a good job, one must first sharpen one's tools. Perhaps because Beck isn't used to being alone, she feels eyes watching her while she works. This unnerves her. Braving her fears, she goes to the river for water and digs a pit at the camp to prepare for a fire. Soon, Beck has a fire going. It seems she is quite capable. Peter, 31, is the fifth contestant. As soon as he lands, Peter wants to go fishing, hoping to catch salmon for dinner. He believes that in the wild, food is the top priority. Without food, it's just a tale of starvation in the wild. Peter finds many signs of animal activity on the riverbank. Setting traps here would surely secure his food supply. The camera shifts back to Chris. He's already got a fire going and is waiting for the creek water to boil. Nearby, there's a small waterfall. Chris, for some reason, is tempted to taste the fresh spring water. Drinking untreated water in the wild poses a great risk due to potential parasites and bacteria, which could end his competition. Yet, Chris can't control himself and takes a few sips before feeling satisfied. Meanwhile, Rob has started to build his shelter. He creates notches in 2 trees to support a horizontal log. A tarpaulin thrown over this makeshift structure provides cover. Rob also gathers ferns to use as a mattress, ensuring a comfortable sleep. Before the competition, Rob was a genuine farmer, living a simple and happy life with a beautiful wife, a son, and a daughter. He joined the competition to improve his family's life. After setting up camp, he scouts the area, finds it very damp with thick moss, and notices many signs of kangaroo activity, indicating food might not be hard to come by. Over with Gina, she experiences strong winds before she even starts building her shelter, and rain seems imminent. She races against time, as she's the only contestant who opted out of using a sleeping bag. She quickly ties a rope between 2 trees and drapes a tarp over it, then cleans up the area around her simple shelter. Gina lived in a very primitive place before the competition, without internet, electricity, or even running water. But these challenges honed her survival skills. Participating feels no different from her daily life. If she wins the $250,000, her first task back home will be to install running water. After finishing her shelter, she needs to start a fire. Gina uses a unique method, tearing a part of her t-shirt to wrap around a fire stick, and with a few strokes, she starts a fire efficiently. As night falls on the first day, Rob successfully keeps his fire going, but rain starts immediately after he boils water, continuing throughout the night. The contestants struggle to adapt to the environment, kept awake by the loud rain. Gina's shelter leaks due to its simplicity, while Beck has the worst luck, as her camp is visited by a Tasmanian devil, known for its powerful bite that can overpower lions and tigers. Dawn brings the second day of competition. After a night of rain, all of Rob's wood is wet, and the cold prevents him from starting a fire. Though he lacks a fire to purify drinking water, he collects enough rainwater from the tarp to make do. Missing his family, Rob pulls out their photos. He even contemplates calling them with the satellite phone, but decides against quitting just yet. As light rain resumes, Rob sits under a tree, homesick, and it's unclear how long he can last in this state. On the other side, Beck's fire has gone out, but fortunately, she still has some dry firewood in her shelter. However, she starts crying before she even begins to make a fire. Yes, she misses home too. Beck has never been alone in her life, and her personality isn't suited for solitary wilderness living. After much contemplation by the river, Beck slowly takes out the satellite phone. Regrettably, Beck becomes the first contestant to withdraw after experiencing just one day in the wilderness. On the second day of the competition, Rob's breakfast consists of plain boiled water. After eating, he sits in his camp, missing his family. Perhaps knowing his performance is lacking, he feels even the birds chirping seems to mock him. Then, Rob looks at a family photo, sees his adorable daughter, and questions why he left his comfortable home to starve here. Although the $250,000 prize is tempting, he concludes nothing beats being with his wife and children. The more he thinks, the sadder he gets, eventually breaking down in tears. Unable to endure a life without his family even for a day, Rob too reaches for the satellite phone and becomes the second contestant to quit, having lasted only 2 days. The scene shifts to Gina, who breathes in the fresh air after a day and night of rain. Today's task is to build a permanent shelter. In Gina's view, a sturdy, rainproof shelter is the key to surviving in the rainforest. Building such a shelter may take several days, during which she won't spend much time searching for food. However, Gina has a plan for this. She gained 19 kilograms before the competition, providing her with 150,000 calories of energy, enough to sustain her early shelter-building efforts. Gina is not only familiar with the competition rules, but has also devised a strategy that might at least see her through to the semifinals. Because it's a permanent shelter, the location must be ideal, elevated to avoid tides, close to a water source, and free from dead trees nearby due to frequent strong winds. She certainly does not want to be hit by falling trees in her sleep. Then enters Mike, the sixth contestant, who is quite tough. To save energy, he doesn't even bother fetching water. He collects rainwater directly from the tarp with his boots and drinks it without boiling, remarking on the good taste. Mike has his own understanding of wilderness survival and excels at making comprehensive plans. His strategy prioritizes food over shelter, as the area doesn't require a sturdy shelter or a warm fireplace like the Arctic might. He believes even a temporary shelter could last 100 days. By focusing on food, Mike even skips making a fire, saving the effort and time needed to maintain it. Mike's approach is quite wild, and whether his strategy works remains to be seen. Jimmy, the youngest competitor this season at 22, was the seventh to appear. He described competing as being like a dream, still feeling surreal about everything. His purpose for joining the competition was to challenge himself. Last night's heavy rain extinguished the campfire, so the plan for the morning was to chop wood to keep it burning. However, chopping wood is physically demanding, and he hadn't eaten since yesterday, which made him start to feel hungry while working. Before the competition, Jimmy lived in a small village and spent most of his time alone outdoors. His parents taught him a lot about wilderness survival, including fishing, trapping, and making traps. He didn't think much about the competition itself, just taking it as far as he could go. But now, Jimmy felt strange, unable to tell if he was cold or hot, possibly due to low blood sugar from not eating. So, he decided to go fishing, grabbed his tools, and headed out. The fishing spot was a distance away from the camp, involving a challenging trek through the terrain, which felt very different from the Arctic with no proper paths and constantly wet ground that was easy to slip on. But Jimmy didn't care much about that now. Getting food was more important, and so he began his fishing career. Meanwhile, Chris also wanted to fish. He noticed a spot in the water bubbling continuously, a sign of either a large catch or fish and shrimp. Before starting, he remembered the old saying, "To do a good job, an artisan needs the best tools." He cut down a straight, long sapling, split and trimmed it to make a sturdy fishing rod. For bait, grabbing a cricket by the river proved much more effective than using modern technology. Chris, too, started his fishing endeavors. Today, Peter probably had the toughest time. He had been careless while setting up camp, hoping a simple shelter would suffice to keep out the rain. However, the overnight storm completely wrecked his camp, soaking all his supplies. His clothes and jacket were unwearable, and even his gloves and socks could wring out water. He faced significant losses on his first day and spent considerable effort fixing the tarp and campsite. On the other hand, Gina finally finished selecting a site for her camp. She picked some thick wood from the forest and carried the logs back to camp, bundling every 3 with shoelaces and setting them up into an A-frame structure. Her camp construction proceeded methodically under her efforts. Pilot Mike also wanted to fish, so he went to the water's edge and dug out some worms from nearly rotten logs, a favorite food for trout. Securing a meal of spicy grilled fish was now only a matter of time. Before starting, however, Mike had to address the complex water surface environment at his location, which could cause problems retrieving the hook. He decided to build a kayak to reach deeper waters for a better fishing setup, starting immediately on the construction. Returning to Hunter Peter, he had set many traps along the riverbank yesterday, and today was the day to check them. Finding them all empty despite nearby tracks puzzled him. After wandering the dense forest for 2 hours without encountering any game or even hearing animals, Peter felt increasingly disheartened. Despite his hunting skills, without game, his efforts were in vain. Returning to the handsome Jimmy, he went back to the shelter without catching any fish. By the afternoon, he still felt unwell. So Jimmy took out the COVID test kit provided by the show's crew and vigorously swabbed his nose. Minutes later, the result revealed that Jimmy had accidentally contracted COVID-19. This was a surprising turn of events. Initially hoping to earn a significant sum, he was diagnosed with COVID-19 just a day into the event. With no room for debate, it was just sheer bad luck. Jimmy then informed the show's crew about his situation over the phone. When the medical team arrived, they were fully equipped and performed a basic check on him. His heart rate was now between 120 and 130, making continued participation in the contest clearly unrealistic. Consequently, Jimmy became the 3rd contestant to be eliminated. Just like the first night, it rained all night again. Keeping dry was indeed uncomfortable. As for Mike, he still hadn't managed to find food, but fortunately, he still had his exclusive secret breakfast. Waking up, he took several big gulps from his boot. Before the competition, Mike had gained 19 kilograms over 2 months, believing this fat would sustain him for at least a month. Yet, despite his endurance, the feeling of hunger was still unbearable. His immediate concern was to find food, as his boat-building plans were not yet feasible. Mike decided to try fishing first. He chopped a long, straight tree and tied a fishing line at the end. For bait, he already had a plan. Seeing a hole in a nearby tree yesterday, he assumed it harbored something. With an axe strike, he hit the jackpot. The insects he found were rich in protein, making them excellent fishing bait. After setting up his fishing rod with the bait, a leaf at the top served as his float. From a distance, he could simply watch the float to see if he caught any fish. Mike was multitasking, proving his skills. However, one fishing rod was clearly not enough. Mike planned to make more in order to increase his chances of catching fish. Next was the 8th female contestant, Kate. For the first 2 days, Kate also struggled to find food, but she didn't feel hungry until the 3rd day. While wandering through the forest, she only encountered a few mushrooms larger than her palm. Fortunately, on her way back to the shelter, she found a patch of reeds whose roots were edible. Casually chopping a few, she found them crisp to bite into. Kate, an ecology PhD focused on wildlife before joining the contest, had extensive experience across Australia and was passionate about hiking. She believed these experiences would help her rank highly in the contest. Back at the shelter, Kate also turned to fishing to supplement her protein intake, using shrimp worms from the riverbank as bait. However, after several hours, no fish had bitten the live bait, suggesting the absence of fish in that spot. She decided to change locations and continue fishing. On the third day, Chris was unusually excited in the morning due to a wonderful dream he had about endless scallops and chicken wings. Yet, reality hit as the camera showed him eating grass. Eager to make his dream come true, Chris took a club and went hunting, aiming to catch a possum to satisfy his cravings. Along the way, he found a piece of dead wood, a natural den preferred by possums. Checking both ends, he found no signs of possum activity. Despite Australia's lush vegetation, its wildlife resources paled in comparison to places like the Arctic, where squirrels and grouse were abundant. Undeterred, Chris returned to the shelter and tried catching rain shrimp, but after several hours, he returned empty-handed. Peter also went hunting. He crossed mountains and waded through waters, but as usual, encountered nothing. Peter explained that he is a professional hunter who specializes in using a shotgun. However, the show's rules prohibit firearms, making him uncomfortable in the competition. Despite finding many mushrooms, he knew they were inedible and could only return to camp empty-handed. Unsure of what to do next, Peter voiced his frustration. Even as an excellent hunter, without game, he felt helpless. Meanwhile, Kate noticed movement on her fishing float and slowly reeled in an eel. She handled the hard-earned protein with care, delivering 2 swift blows to secure it. Eels are not to be underestimated. They contain 15% fat and provide 200 calories per 100 grams. With food secured, Kate hurried back to her shelter to cook the eel, becoming the first contestant of the season to consume protein. Dwayne, the season's 9th contestant, found 2 mole crickets by a tree root. He found them rather disgusting, but used them as bait for fishing. Before he could start, however, a heavy rain began, and he discovered a hole in his rain cover. With no other option, he used an axe to hold the cover in place. Chris felt despondent today, having caught neither possums nor lobsters. Restless and prone to overthinking, he decided to keep busy by weaving a fishing net. Having suffered severe stress disorder during his military service in the Middle East, Chris often felt anxious. While making the net, he experienced chest tightness and decided to go fishing to calm down, though he doubted he could last much longer in his current state. Mike was actively building a boat, believing that setting up fishing nets in the river would yield a continuous catch. Still, he recognized the gap between imagination and reality. To expedite the boat's construction, he chopped down another tree and crafted a hammer handle using an axe and a knife. He took great care in preparing the canoe's beams, ensuring no bark or splinters could puncture the boat. However, he knew his efforts would be wasted if he failed to catch any fish. Back to Chris, his fishing rod finally showed signs of life. Although the fish was small, trout not only provide protein but also valuable vitamins and have a great taste. Excited about the prospect of fish soup for dinner, Chris danced joyfully. On his way back to the shelter, he shouted into the forest, "Possums, you're safe for now." Peter was having the toughest time. After another fruitless walk and a fall that resulted in a bruised knee and a bump on the back of his head, he felt utterly dejected. Reviewing his recent plight, his rain cover failed on the first day, soaking all his gear. The second day brought no gains, and today was no better. Back at the shelter, Peter began packing his equipment, feeling no point in continuing. Like a card game, he could have persevered with a decent hand, but facing such scarcity, he saw no reason to continue suffering. Resigned, Peter called the show's crew to discuss his situation. The camera shifts to Mike, who continues his shipbuilding project methodically. Despite Tasmania's limited resources, Mike believes that once the ship is completed, he can set up permanent fishing lines and gill nets in deeper waters to solve the food issue once and for all. Considering the long-term strategy, he thinks it's worth enduring a few more days of hunger. Today, Mike went to gather wood from the forest when he noticed marks on a tree, which he identified as those made by a possum. This is the first sign of animal activity he has seen since arriving at the competition site. Consequently, Mike plans to set up a trail camera to see if he can capture the possum. Dwayne, who has been rarely seen, finally makes an appearance. Up to now, he has been living in a temporary shelter that requires him to crawl to enter, and he wishes to leave it as soon as possible. In fact, Dwayne started building a permanent shelter on the second day, but intermittent rain has delayed the progress. His shelter, which is the most luxurious of the season, is entirely made of wooden frames. Even the walls are made of sturdy wood. He built such a large shelter hoping it would withstand any weather and help him win the $250,000 prize. However, I always felt that Dwayne might end up like his predecessors, who abandoned their grand houses. Unfortunately, the shelter collapsed while installing the last wall, thwarting his moving plans for the day and forcing him to spend another night in the original shelter. The last contestant of the season, Michael, also makes an appearance. As the final contestant, Michael must be competent. For breakfast, he collected dew from a tarp, even ignoring the small animal droppings on it by pretending they didn't exist. Michael, a rural veterinarian before the competition, leads a life not much different from solitary wilderness living. He owns several hills in South Wales where he usually hunts, fishes, and catches lobsters, so his survival skills are well honed. His best skill is problem solving. Today, Michael plans to explore the mountains, hunt some game along the way, and familiarize himself with the terrain. The path started densely vegetated, but soon widened. Under a tree root, Michael found a patch of reeds, which taste quite good and make a decent lunch when game is scarce. However, as he progressed, the trail became more complicated, often requiring him to crawl, and he gradually lost his way. Now, finding any game is less of a concern than returning to his shelter before dark. Meanwhile, Mike's shipbuilding is troubled by Tasmania's unpredictable weather, with rain interrupting work every few minutes, alternating with clear skies. After just completing the boat's frame, rain forced him to retreat to his shelter to work on designing a luxurious fishing rod, confident it would at least get him through to the semi-finals. Upon testing the rod at the river, a sudden downpour cut the fishing short, emphasizing the season's challenging weather. Michael, still in the mountainous woods, has been lost for 2 hours, growing increasingly anxious. Even if he called for rescue, the crew might not find him immediately. After consulting his compass and deciding to head south, he continued until 4 p.m. without any clue of his whereabouts. Half an hour later, hearing the sound of a river and following the downhill terrain, he felt hopeful of finding a way out. Finally, 40 minutes before dark, Michael made it back to his shelter, exhausted and without any game. On day 5 of the competition, Mike checked the video footage and was thrilled to see a possum moving around. Without prey traces, he could have focused on building his boat. Now with a possum sighted, his attention was completely captured. Eager for protein, he decided to drop all other tasks and focus on crafting a large net to catch the possum. Kate, the only intellectual contestant, enjoyed her eel meal yesterday, but it was too greasy. She plans to use her strengths and find some vegetables in the forest, needing fiber after the oily eel. She found some coffee berries and, knowing they were edible, decided to test them first. She crushed the berries and applied them to the sensitive skin inside her elbow, then collected a large batch and returned to her shelter. After confirming no allergic reactions, she safely started her lunch. The berries were tart and sweet, resembling raspberries. Dwayne's shelter is almost complete, making today a perfect moving day. He just needs to finish the roof with a waterproof cover. Once done, he could live there for a year, enjoying the solitude of Tasmania. However, his plan to collect firewood was ruined by a sudden heavy rain, forcing him to start preparing for fishing from inside the shelter. Meanwhile, Gina took off her shoes again, enjoying walking barefoot on soft moss. Her house modifications were nearly complete. Today, by arranging her bedding, she could sleep comfortably even without a sleeping bag. She built a frame and fixed the bed planks about 20 to 30 centimeters off the ground, placing ribs between them and covering them with a soft leather coat. By evening, she was done, and she looked well rested the next morning. Just as she was anticipating a fresh start, she heard noises from the river and rushed to check. It was a platypus swimming, a creature known to be inedible, even in dire straits. Chris is still working on his net, showing signs of nervousness. He has not completed any task, from catching fish to hunting. He revisited a tree hollow where he had previously seen no possum traces. Considering the risks of poisonous snakes, he hesitated to explore a large tree hollow he could crawl into. Fearing a snake bite in such a secluded spot, he withdrew. He was certain the hollow housed a possum, likely not at home at the time. Chris then tried fishing, setting up 5 rods, but hours passed with no bites. Frustrated, He lamented the scarcity of resources, feeling his efforts were in vain and losing confidence day by day. This afternoon, Mike finally completed his large net. Now he just needs to set up the trap, and he might enjoy a delicious possum meal tonight. Mike's trap is a bit complex to describe. It involves laying the net on the ground and setting a trigger. If an animal triggers it, a piece of wood suspended from a tree lifts the net. By the time Mike had set up the trap, it was dark. He felt that this trap was less practical than a simple rabbit snare. Restless, he couldn't sleep until 9 p.m., constantly thinking about checking the trap. Finally, at 10 p.m., he couldn't resist and went to check, only to find the trap empty, undisturbed. Disappointed, Mike checked the camera tied to the tree and saw that a possum had indeed approached the trap, but was scared away by the sound of his footsteps. Chris has been starving, his back sticking to his chest from hunger. Throughout the competition, except for catching a trout on day 3, he has gone 5 days without food. He desperately needs a turning point, otherwise he doesn't know how to continue. Suddenly, Chris noticed a movement on his fishing rod. Another trout. With this fish, his plummeting confidence instantly surged.
I feel like I should be more excited, like I'm absolutely in shock. Oh, no way. Wow. Okay. I can go in there like that. Don't never not ever give up. There's nowhere else I want to be right now than here. And that's honestly the truth.
Gina encountered some trouble today. For unknown reasons, she developed large patches of hives on her thighs. The bumps were red and itchy and could not be scratched. Gina had to work around the camp without pants, finishing up her shelter. She then nailed 7 wooden stakes in front of her shelter and tied lines above them. She brought a bundle of sagebrush and started weaving it through the lines like fabric, creating a door curtain. After moving to his new home, Dwayne felt great and even tried surfing by the river, though his falling technique was not pretty. With his shelter completed, the competition moved to the next phase, focusing on securing food. Hunting seemed out of the question for Dwayne. His only hope was fishing. Lacking a float in his 10 items, he dismantled buttons from his raincoat and used the springs as sinkers. While fishing, Dwayne's stomach constantly growled, urging him to find food quickly. Unfortunately, after fishing all afternoon, he caught nothing. Chris, after feasting on the fish, relaxed under the sun at his camp and decided to take a bath to fully unwind. However, the temperature was only 9 degrees Celsius. Chris regretted entering the water immediately and started swearing.
God almighty, that's bloody cold! Oh.
He overlooked a crucial fact. The water body was already nearly devoid of fish, and his disturbance might cause him to starve for the next few days. Clearly, Chris hadn't realized the severity of the situation, or he wouldn't have casually played with stacking stones. Gina estimated she had lost 7 kilograms and could almost button up pants that previously didn't fit. She continued working on the door curtain, and the good news was that she expected to finish it by tonight. As night fell, she installed the curtain on her shelter. After 8 days of non-stop work, her living situation was finally sorted. Next, she planned to focus on securing food, believing she could be the first woman to win. Mike's engineering project is still ongoing. Besides that, he made a fishing rod and a spike net trap. However, he has yet to secure any food. He went back to the mountain to check the trap, but unfortunately, it still had not caught a possum. The surveillance showed the possum returned after he left. It seemed to smell the trap, moving through it without setting it off. Mike then decided to add more triggers on both sides. It's possible the reason he hasn't caught the possum is due to their keen sense of smell. Human scent might have been left on the trap, allowing the possum to avoid it. As of now, Mike is the only contestant who hasn't made a fire. Initially, he thought maintaining a fire would be too draining, but now, considering he might soon obtain food, he planned a fire pit in front of his camp. Given Tasmania's frequent rain every few minutes, he also needed to construct a rain shelter for it. He found a robust tree, chopped off a large, intact piece of bark with his axe, and used it as a protective cover for the fire pit. Dwayne, still without food, rested at the shelter and decided to try fishing elsewhere. He found a new bay and repeatedly cast his line. Just as his patience was wearing thin, he finally felt a tug. Catching the fish greatly improved Dwayne's mood.
I'm happy.
This lake trout made him the third contestant this season to consume protein. The hard-earned food was taken back to the shelter. Dwayne intended to grill the fish, but struggled with his fire-making skills. After 2 hours of trying, he failed to get a fire going. Frustrated and unable to bear the hunger, Dwayne considered eating the raw fish. Fortunately, the trout had few parasites and was quite fresh, though a bit fishy. That night, Michael was terribly nauseated. He felt a buzzing on his head, and upon checking his hat, found a fly had nested and laid eggs inside it. Michael had to use tweezers to remove the maggots one by one. The next day, he decided to improve his personal hygiene using his backpack's rain cover as a makeshift bathtub, filling it with lake water. He then heated up a fire, warmed stones in it, and placed them in the bathtub to heat the water for a comfortable bath. Personal hygiene is easier to manage for male contestants. Female contestants face more challenges, such as Kate, whose toilet paper ran out on day 10. Luckily, she found soft dogwood leaves that felt almost like toilet paper. She planned to stock up on them. Additionally, she discovered a plant whose leaves contained a chemical that, when crushed, acted like soap nuts. Kate experimented by the river and successfully created foam by rubbing the leaves. On the 10th day, Dwayne seemed melancholic, possibly from eating too much raw fish. He then carved intricate patterns of flowing streams, rolling mountains, and free-swimming fish, along with himself on his axe handle, marking his wilderness solitude. He pondered the essence of loneliness. Back home, each family member has their spirit bird. His wife's is a crow. Having not seen a crow throughout the competition, he took it as a sign when one flew over his campsite today. Believing it was a message from his wife, he decided to withdraw from the competition. The kayak built by the expert is finally completed. Mike, after several busy days, is eager for its maiden voyage. He brings the kayak to the shore and stuffs all his gear into it. With the preparations complete and his carefully made paddle in hand, Mike cautiously sits in the kayak. To his surprise, it turns out to be a bit small. Even a simple leg movement takes effort. Once everything is ready, Mike paddles forward, but in the next second, the kayak capsizes, causing an embarrassing situation. After 10 days of hard work, the result is disappointing. Fortunately, it isn't winter. Otherwise, a fall into the water would mean dropping out of the race. Currently, Chris has gathered the most food, allowing him to leisurely sing in the shelter. Today's plan is to catch some crayfish in the forest after discovering a stream there, which is ideal for crayfish. Catching them is easy with a bit of bait, as crayfish cling to it unless pulled out of the water. However, despite waiting, Chris sees no crayfish, guessing either the bait isn't enticing enough or the crayfish are too timid. Ultimately, he tries reaching for them with his hands but ends up empty-handed. Returning to the shelter, Chris feels despondent. Just then, a helicopter flies overhead, triggering Chris's anxiety. He served in Iraq, where his tent was near a helipad, and he suffers from PTSD. The sound of the helicopter overwhelms him emotionally. He worries about other contestants being injured and finds himself in tears amid a wave of panic. The helicopter lingers, prolonging his distress until he gradually recovers. It's been 6 months since his last episode, but the stress of the competition and the helicopter might have triggered a relapse. His PTSD poses a significant risk that could lead to a breakdown during the show. Kate had a rough night with noises near her tent. As a wildlife biologist, she suspects small animals like possums or wallabies are responsible, driven by professional curiosity rather than a desire to hunt them. She finds a trail behind the camp, leading to droppings between 2 trees, larger ones likely from a wallaby and smaller from a possum. She studies them closely, concluding that this is what wildlife biologists do. Back at the shelter, Kate isn't interested in hunting, even if it costs her the championship. On the 10th day, Gina finally starts looking for food as her weight drops by 1 kilogram a day. Needing food, she opts for carbohydrates and finds sagebrush near her camp. Its roots are starch-rich, so she collects a bunch, washes and chops them, then simmers them on low heat. However, instead of turning into a paste, she ends up with root soup, which tastes awful even after adding salt. Worse, drinking salt water on an empty stomach causes her to vomit, highlighting the risks of such an action. Last night, Kate finally met her neighbor as she had suspected. It was indeed several possums. This time, 3 appeared at once, and Kate thought they might be a family. She had initially thought possums were just large rats, but found them quite cute. After greeting her neighbor, Kate felt completely satisfied, and the possum family reminded her of her own family. She wished her 2 children were also there with her. Michael also encountered the possums that night, but unlike Kate, he is no wildlife biologist. Hearing noises, Michael's first thought was that it was food. He quickly grabbed his equipment to catch the possums. However, the possums were clever. Seeing Michael, they immediately kept quiet, and he returned to his shelter empty-handed. Just as he lay down to rest, the possums started making noise again. It seemed they didn't like their neighbor Michael and were trying to drive him away. After several disturbances through the night, he finally made it to dawn. For a quieter sleep in the future and to catch some game to fill his stomach, Michael planned to make a trap. His plan was to build a box with a lid and set up an ambush in a spot the possums frequented. It was not difficult to find materials in the rainforest. Soon Michael had collected a pile of logs. He then went to the slope behind his shelter and observed the terrain, noting that animals would pass there to drink water. Michael then started building the trap by driving stakes into the ground. After yesterday's kayak flipping incident, Mike did not lose faith in his kayak. He checked for leaks and found that a piece of the rain cover was below the water level. By slightly raising the seam, he fixed the problem. After repairing the kayak, Mike planned to go back on the water. He paddled and felt much better than last time, gaining confidence and speeding up. After much effort over several days, he finally began his fishing venture in the middle of the lake. After a day's rest, Chris finally recovered from his stress disorder. Arriving at the lake, he noticed his fishing rod moving.
There's the bait. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Yes, 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 yes. Yeah! Yeah! Woohoo! We're having trout for breakfast. Insanely tough and challenging and absolute paradise.
After tidying up the shelter, Kate went back to the forest. She took out a shovel and quickly unearthed several large, fat worms. Kate then placed the worms in a tin can. They were just her fishing bait. No wonder Kate always managed to catch eels with such big, lively bait. However, Chris's mental state finally collapsed. Although he tried to recover from his stress disorder, the lack of food and the excitement of helicopters deepened his self-doubt. Even the perfect scenery of Tasmania, like a wonderland from Alice's dreams, could not keep him interested. Rather than continue to struggle, Chris decisively called the program team.
I feel like I'm not going to regret leaving today. Now's the time. I guess realising that there's still a lot of work to go. And it was great. I was loving it. I definitely need people in my life. Hopefully I've inspired at least one person.
Mike's boat building and fishing plans were unsuccessful. To date, he had not caught any protein, despite his efforts. He had the season's best fishing rod, and had built the most complex trap of the season, and spent a lot of time building his kayak. Yet, he still caught nothing, feeling like a student with lots of supplies, but poor results. Now that his boating and fishing were hindered, Mike decided to refocus on the trap, hoping to catch a possum for a substantial meal. Unfortunately, the trap on the mountain still had no game. Mike checked the camera again. The little kangaroo that appeared last time came to the trap again, but no matter how much the kangaroo fussed, the trap was not triggered. Frustrated by the ineffective trap, Mike laughed. He didn't understand why the tripwire wasn't working. He then returned to the shelter to get a backpack, planning to simulate the kangaroo's movement to figure out why the trap wasn't triggered. The result was rather strange. It was as if the kangaroo had the ability to phase through walls. Kate brought worms to the shore to start fishing despite the chilly 8-degree weather and light rain. The lure of food kept her fishing in the rain. Soon there was a stir, and she caught another eel, even bigger than the last. Kate quickly took it to a stump for processing. Facing this hard-earned protein, she wasted no time. She skinned and gutted it smoothly.
Woo, eel skin. Okay. Yeah, baby. It's all really good fats and protein for me.
Then started a wilderness mukbang at the camp. Day 15 was routine medical checkup day, and the medical team arrived early at Mike's camp. After a thorough examination, they found Mike had low blood pressure and had lost 11.7% of his body weight in 2 weeks. When asked about his recent diet, Mike was so embarrassed he wished he could disappear. He had been starving. On day 2, Mike checked his trap again. This time it had been triggered, but sadly, still no prey. He checked the camera and saw a possum that had easily sabotaged the trap. If not for the footage, Mike would have thought the possum was enchanted. Gina's attempt at making root vegetable soup was unsuccessful, causing her to vomit for hours. She acknowledged the need for real food. After greeting a platypus by the river in the morning, Gina headed into the mountains equipped for foraging, planning to stay for 90 days. Unaware she had made it to the semi-finals, Gina would have been thrilled. Back home, she knew of a fern rich in starch, tasting like potatoes. It took climbing 2 mountains to find it. She skillfully stripped the leaves and chopped the roots, eagerly cooking a big pot back at the shelter. 2 hours later, Gina shook her head in disappointment. The caloric output surpassed the intake. She realized she needed to focus on obtaining proteins and fats. Michael's trap, essentially a cage made of branches with a small mechanism at the entrance, was finally complete. It looked less effective than Mike's, and without any bait, it was uncertain if it would catch anything. The competition reached day 20. Gina spent the morning watching her fishing line by the river with no bites. A large bird passing by seemed a good omen, so she changed her fishing spot in the afternoon. Soon, her line began to shake violently, and she caught a large trout, her first protein since the competition began. Back at the shelter, she fried the fish, seasoning it lightly, making the neighboring men envious. Boat expert Mike also switched to fishing, setting up several lines, but had no luck until one line tightened. He struggled to secure the very slippery eel, and just as he was about to use his knife, the eel escaped, leaving Mike heartbroken. Kate starts her morning with routine breathing exercises to cleanse her spirit, followed by cleansing her body. She strips off her clothes and jumps into the cold water, which is only 8 degrees Celsius. Since obtaining an eel yesterday, Gina's vitality has reached a new level. She lifted a large patch of moss in front of the camp, initially thought to be used to reinforce the shelter. However, she suddenly started collecting earthworms, putting them into her boots. She collected over a dozen before returning to the shelter. Gina learned that many animals enjoy eating earthworms because they are rich in protein. Coincidentally, protein was exactly what Gina was lacking. She boldly thought of cooking the earthworms on a hot plate to see if they could sustain her. If her plan worked, the open ground outside could provide a continuous source of protein. She fried the earthworms until golden brown on both sides, tasted one, and found the flavor acceptable despite a slight earthy taste. Meanwhile, Michael's ongoing battle with a possum continues. He checked the traps in the woods today but found nothing. However, he noticed the trapdoor had been triggered and checked the tracking camera. Like a neighbor who faced a similar challenge, the possum had triggered the trap but did not enter the cage. Disappointed, he returned to the shelter with no gains. It was puzzling how he had survived over 20 days, which remained a mystery until today. It turns out that Michael had been eating river grass, rich in dietary fiber and vitamin C, which, despite its poor taste and low calories, kept him from starving. The psychological pressure of not finding food was immense, making him often think of his family. Without a miracle, his withdrawal from the competition seemed imminent. Kate, reflecting on her life, seemed to have found some answers. Today, the 22nd day of the competition, holds special significance for her since her mother's favorite number was also 22. Her mother passed away at 46, having always wanted to visit South America but never making it there. Kate often wished her mother were still alive, as she would have been a wonderful grandmother. With no need for the competition's $250,000 prize for living, Kate's goal was to return home and be a good mother. Having realized this, she called the show's producers and withdrew from the competition without regrets. Today, Gina caught another big fish, her third in as many days, overshadowing the 2 male competitors. She made a pot of fish soup with the fish head and cartilage, which left her profoundly satisfied. Given her progress, winning the championship seemed almost certain by day 23. Mike was nearby, overturning decayed wood in search of bait to continue his fishing. After much effort with no sight of bait, he felt nearly defeated and sat by the river for a long time. He later found a new spot with plenty of earthworms and secured 5 fishing lines, then sat by the shore to monitor them, as the competition rules required to prevent accidental harm to protected animals. At 10 p.m., one of the lines moved. He cautiously approached, mindful of his previous experiences with eels escaping. This fish was too important to lose, so Mike decided to strip down and retrieve it from the water. Finally, with the help of a net, the eel was successfully captured. After 23 days, Mike finally caught some protein. Desperate with hunger, Mike didn't care what time it was and devoured the eel overnight.
Wow, what an amazing fish. Whew. Wow.
Now, Michael is the one suffering. He's been surviving on seaweed, and over the 23 days, he's lost 20 kilograms. He wonders if it's still worth continuing the competition. Initially, his aim to win $250,000 wasn't for himself. He and his wife started a welfare school in Congo. The prize money would cover a year and a half of staff salaries. It turns out Michael is a real philanthropist. Hopefully, he wins in the end. On day 24, Gina was drawn to the water by a flapping noise. At first, she thought a platypus got tangled in the fishing line, but it was another trout on the hook.
Excuse me for a minute, because I've got to do this. I really feel like this land is just looking after me.
Since catching the eel yesterday, Mike seemed unstoppable. The next morning, he caught another eel, skinned it, and removed its guts. However, he didn't rush to eat this one. Eels have 5 to 6 times more fat than regular fish. Mike was too full from last night's meal and kept burping. Eating now could cause vomiting, which would be a loss. To enhance the eel's flavor, Mike decided against boiling it. Boiled eel was too greasy. He skillfully stripped bark from a stump, shaped it into a cylinder, and hung it over a fire. It seems he planned to smoke the eel. It was ready by nightfall.
Yes. That is magical. Yum. It's just like greasy and fatty. Has to be fresh worms, and I've learned how to get the fresh worms, so fortunes have changed.
Remembering the fishing line stuck in the water days ago, Mike thought a big eel might be the cause. Given the food shortage, he considered diving in despite the risks. Humans can become exhausted and lose consciousness in water below 15 degrees Celsius within 30 minutes, and the water was even colder. Going in was practically risking his life. Fed up with being hungry all day, Mike decided to dive. Following the line, he reached a deep area where he suddenly sank. He emerged empty-handed, the fishing line tangled in underwater debris. Seeing the risks, Mike reluctantly swam back. After this lesson, he vowed never to set hooks in that area again. Michael moved to a new area he discovered days ago, noting kangaroo tracks and cleaner water. He believed his current plight was due to the poor resources of his initial campsite. Indeed, one can't survive on barren land. So, Michael planned to move, a huge task given his weakened state. He thought the old camp had no hope left, and continuing meant likely withdrawal from the competition. Sometimes a change in direction could lead to better prospects. At worst, he'd return home empty-handed. However, Michael underestimated the difficulty of moving. The first trip, carrying only camera gear and a backpack, exhausted all his energy. He feared Michael might quit after moving. The camera shifts to Gina's side. Due to the rule that one must watch the fishing line, Gina stays up until it's completely dark without sleeping, waiting for a fish to bite. Unexpectedly, it starts to rain after a while. She decides to pull in the line and go to sleep. Braving the dark and rain, Gina heads to the water's edge. Just when she is about to give up, she catches a fish unexpectedly, her 7th recent catch. If the 2 male competitors next door knew, they would probably be jealous. Gina wonders why fate seems so unfair. On the 27th day of the competition, 3 days have passed since Mike last had fish. Whether he has had any other catches can be guessed from his expression. Following the old saying, "A rolling stone gathers no moss," Mike plans to check the other side of the river. However, with dark clouds and gusty winds, crossing the river in a kayak is risky. The irregular airflow could send the kayak drifting erratically. Nevertheless, the wind doesn't stop by afternoon, nor does it worsen, so Mike decides to take the risk. If the opposite shore has abundant resources, he could thrive. Upon reaching the western bank, he finds a clean pond and starts fishing. But fate plays tricks again. It starts raining not long after he begins. Staying warm is crucial for survival in the wild, so Mike has no choice but to paddle back. With no food in his stomach, the round trip consumes a significant amount of calories. This venture has taken a severe toll. Gina fried a fish for breakfast in the morning, living a seemingly enchanted life that the neighboring competitors can only envy. To date, Gina is the only contestant who has escaped the pangs of hunger. With a daily intake of 1 kilogram of protein, it's believable she could last until the production company goes bankrupt. However, this inevitably leads to cliched introspection. Initially, Gina said loneliness had no impact on her. She had a platypus as a neighbor and birds as friends, asserting that being without humans didn't equate to loneliness. Now, she is curious about how the other contestants are doing and how many remain in competition with her. Her admission of these thoughts indicates she's beginning to feel the solitude. Soon enough, Gina expresses a wish for someone to be there to give her a gentle hug and to look into her eyes and say, "I need you." Michael's relocation efforts continue, costing him many calories. But looking at the environment, the clear stream, and the aquatic plants, he feels hopeful. Fishing here could sustain him. He clears a small area and sets up a rain shelter. Tonight, he plans to camp here. Since crossing the river, Mike has become much more cautious. His strategy is to stay put unless absolutely necessary, even if it means surviving like Juan to the very end. His daily routine involves watching the fishing line at the campsite. As dusk approaches, the line finally shows signs of activity. Mike quickly grabs his net. After 4 hungry days, he finally catches a fish. Thinking of his neighbor Michael, it seems this season's championship could be a contest between Mike and Gina. On the morning of day 28, Michael is busy packing up the camp. Due to the tight schedule yesterday, he didn't set up his bed and ended up with a sore back. Today, after finishing his packing, he plans to rest all day in bed, conserving energy while actively looking for food. This competition is a rare opportunity for Michael, but it comes at a cost to himself and his family. Later, Michael starts a heartfelt confession to his family in front of the camera. However, he breaks down crying. Surviving in the wild has been extremely difficult. Given Michael's situation, withdrawing from the competition seems to be his next step. Michael noticed frost at the competition site early in the morning. This was definitely bad news for the contestants. Lower temperatures meant harder access to food and quicker energy loss. Fortunately, Michael had completed his moving project. He hoped to sustain himself by fishing in the area, using a small tree as a fishing rod, and thus began his fishing endeavor. However, Tasmanian weather seemed to conspire against him as it started to drizzle shortly. Michael had no choice but to return to his shelter in despair. By day 31, it was time for a routine medical checkup. The 2 male contestants were nervous about it, fully aware of their condition. Losing weight rapidly due to lack of food, they risked being advised to leave the show if they failed the medical exam. To avoid this, both men drank a lot of water before the medical team's arrival to maintain their weight. Fortunately, they both passed the checkup. Mike found it hard to believe and was curious to see how much he had slimmed down. Taking advantage of the warm noon, he undressed to check his body, finding his once plump belly now wrinkled. He estimated that the 19 kilograms he had gained before the competition were likely depleted. Mike felt that without finding food soon, the medical team would not allow him another 30 days unless he caught fish or game. Speaking of fishing, he thought using worms would be best, so he went to the forest to look for them. Yet today, the worms seemed to be playing hide and seek, and he couldn't find any. The reason was obvious. As mentioned earlier, the competition site had experienced frost, driving the worms deeper into the ground to avoid the freeze. Digging deeper in the usual spots would surely yield worms. After the medical team left, Michael felt crushed. He almost wished they had disqualified him, so he could go home without struggling over whether to quit. From day 1, he had been starving, dealing with both physical decline and immense mental pressure. He knew his performance would likely be mocked when the show aired, making him look like a clown. After much thought, Michael decided to quit voluntarily. Following his departure, only Gina and Mike remained, marking the official entry into the final stage of the Wilderness Alone Australia competition. Given the current situation, Gina winning seemed almost certain. However, even she couldn't prevent losing weight as the weather grew colder. She considered changing her survival strategy, starting with upgrading the shelter's door curtain. She constructed a frame from branches, filled it with bushes, and placed it at the entrance to block the cold air. After finishing, she was a bit hungry and reheated some fish soup from 2 days prior. Unfortunately, it tasted sour, likely spoiled. At such a critical moment in the competition, even with food scarcity, she couldn't risk eating spoiled food, as it could lead to vomiting or gastroenteritis, wiping out all her advantages. Despite her caution, Gina still suffered from diarrhea at night. While dealing with it, a dark figure suddenly darted beside her, scaring her tremendously. Acting on instinct, Gina grabbed a stick and struck the dark figure. To her surprise, the figure lay motionless on the ground after being hit. When she turned on her headlamp for a better look, she froze. It was a small kangaroo. Desperate for food, this unexpected prey seemed like a gift from heaven. Surely, winning the competition without making use of such a gift would be unthinkable. The valuable protein source meant skinning and gutting the kangaroo immediately, followed by preparing a meal on a hot plate. After days of hunger, this meal revitalized Gina. In stark contrast, Mike was having a much harder time. His attempts at fishing were unsuccessful, and possums teased him daily, eluding every trap he set. Disappointed with his original traps, Mike planned a new, larger net, swearing to capture the elusive possum. Learning from past failures, he designed a net that would fall from above and was more sensitive than the previous one. The effectiveness of this new trap remained to be seen. That night, Mike heard the trap trigger and quickly checked with his headlamp, only to find the trap empty again. Reviewing the surveillance camera footage, he saw the possum dodge the net at the last second. Frustrated, Mike didn't bother packing up the trap and went back to sleep in his shelter. If he knew that Gina had managed to knock down a kangaroo with just a stick, it would probably make him want to quit the competition. Feeling incredibly down, Mike looked at his family photo, something he had avoided since starting the competition. He knew that reminiscing about home could lead to him quitting, but the consecutive setbacks left him needing comfort from the sight of his wife and children. The next morning, Gina processed the kangaroo, expertly shaving off the meat, which she then cut into fine strips, salted, and hung over the fire to roast. She estimated the kangaroo could yield about 5 kilograms of protein, enough to sustain her for another half-month. She wasted none of the kangaroo, roasting the bones on the fire and eagerly eating them. Since day 30, Mike had not caught anything, and hunger had visibly changed his appearance. Despite this, he decided to reset his traps, if only for psychological comfort. Surprisingly, while resetting the traps, he found 2 earthworms and hurriedly used them as bait for fishing. That evening, a fish finally bit, providing Mike with much-needed sustenance just as he was about to give up. On day 51 of the competition, Mike made a cake from mud and decorated it with green plants, then created fireworks with a fire stick. It was his son Tom's 14th birthday, and Mike celebrated this special day, also celebrating his own recent catch. Fortuitously, he had caught 4 fish the previous night. After processing the fish, his shelter looked more bountiful than a holiday feast. With his spirits lifted by the abundance of food, Mike felt he could continue competing for several more days. Even with Gina's kangaroo meat, it was uncertain who could last longer. Gina's kangaroo meat had dwindled after a few days of consumption. Recently, she cooked it with eel in a mixed stew to save food. Even so, the remaining meat would last at most 1 more week. Considering the future, Gina decided to supplement her diet with green vegetables for more variety and balanced nutrition. She went to a spot where she previously gathered berries, only to find it now occupied by a venomous snake. Gina was understandably alarmed, but seeing the snake as potential food, she decided to take a risk. Unfortunately, she had left her axe at home and lacked any suitable tools. Moreover, the snake was highly alert. Gina then planned to subdue it with a stick. While searching for a stick, she realized the snake was a highly venomous tiger snake, ranked 4th worldwide. Realizing the danger of a potential bite, she hurried back to her shelter. By day 55, the time had passed quickly due to continuous storms with strong winds. Mike struggled to keep his shelter secured during the weather. Gina's situation wasn't much better. The rain kept her confined, making hunting or fishing impossible. However, her shelter was sturdier than Mike's. The downside was her lack of a sleeping bag, forcing her to modify the fireplace for warmth at night. On day 58, Mike was distressed when he detected a strange smell at night and discovered some of his fish had spoiled. He reluctantly cut off the spoiled parts and stewed them again, despite the risks. By day 59, fortunately, Mike had no adverse effects from the fish, but his fish supply was nearly gone, with the last one lasting only 2.5 more days. The low water levels made fishing increasingly difficult, forcing him to reduce his food portions. By day 61, Mike had only one piece of fish left. After finishing it, he even licked the pot lid, knowing the survival challenge had escalated. Day 64 marked a special occasion as it was Mike's birthday and the routine medical checkup by the show's crew. By then, Mike had lost 25% of his initial body weight, had no body fat, and very low blood pressure. When he was informed of his elimination, he was not overly upset, but relieved that the ordeal was over. Although he did not win, he felt satisfied with his efforts and looked forward to seeing his family. The winner of the first season of Alone in Australia was announced, and it was Gina, the series' first female champion. Unknown to her at the time, the crew planned to bring her family to her and pretend to conduct a medical checkup. Her family would surprise her by appearing behind her unexpectedly.
What the fuck?
Yeah.